Yahweh our Father in heaven, we come before you humbly, recognizing you as the source of all wisdom. We ask for your guidance as we look at your word, that we might grow closer to you and understand the life you desire for us. Amen. Welcome, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Leviticus chapter 11. It's more than just old rules. We're seeking to understand Yahweh's heart for his people. Today we'll explore the clean and unclean animals, which were vital distinctions for his people then, and still hold profound meaning for us today.
Amen. And to you, dear listener, we come to this exploration as fellow servants of Yahweh. We want to approach these divine guidelines from the viewpoint of an Israelite, someone grounded in faith and looking to live a life wholly devoted to him. You've probably seen these passages before, and maybe you wondered about what they mean for us today. That's what we're here to uncover, to unravel these instructions through the lens of our faith, revealing not just what was allowed or forbidden, but also showing the deeper meaning for those who want to center their lives around Yahweh.
Exactly. So we'll go through Leviticus 11 verse by verse and look at the animal kingdom as it's presented there. Land animals, sea creatures, birds, insects, even those that creep on the earth. We'll examine them all. We're not just making a grocery list, though. Our goal is to see the order in Yahweh's creation and how these distinctions can lead us to a holier life.
Right. And Leviticus 11, verse 3, starts by giving us the characteristics of clean animals on the land. They must have a split hoof and chew the cud. Now, these aren't random features. Think about it. The split hoof could be a symbol of separation, of choosing a distinct path and chewing the cud, bringing the food back up to digest it again. Maybe that's a picture of thoughtfully considering, really processing what nourishes us.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. It brings to mind the flocks and herds that were so important to the Israelites. Cattle, sheep, goats. And then there's wild game like deer and bison too. These animals just seem to embody those qualities Yahweh laid out. Now, on the flip side, we have those animals considered unclean in Leviticus 11, verses 4 through 8. What made them unsuitable, even to the point of making someone unclean just by touching them?
Well, the text spells it out clearly. It's the absence of either one or both of those key features. Look at the camel in verse 4. It chews the cud, which you'd think would be enough, but it doesn't have a fully split hoof. Verses 5 and 6 talk about the rock hyrax and the hare, which both chew the cud but don't have hooves that are split. Yahweh specifically says these are unclean for you, which makes it personal, a part of the covenant relationship.
It's so interesting that both characteristics are needed. It's not enough to just digest your food a certain way. That physical mark of the hoof matters just as much. And then there's the pig, mentioned in verse 7. It always stands out because it does have a split hoof, which you'd think would make it clean, but it doesn't chew the cud.
Exactly. The pig has that outward appearance of the split hoof, but it's missing that other crucial element. It shows how Yahweh's designation took into account both internal and external aspects. And while the horse, a common animal back then, isn't specifically mentioned, we can guess from these guidelines that it would also be unclean. It doesn't have a split hoof or chew the cud. There's a clear system here, not just random rules.
It does seem to point to something deeper. And it went beyond just whether you could eat these animals, too. You mentioned earlier that even touching them had consequences. It wasn't just a matter of taste.
Absolutely. Verse 8 makes it clear, don't eat their meat or touch their dead bodies. They are unclean to you. And verse 24 says the same thing about other unclean animals. Now, this uncleanness wasn't about germs and hygiene like we think about it today. It was about ritual purity, a temporary separation from the sacred parts of Israelite life. Contact with death, especially, often caused this state of uncleanness, and purification was needed before someone could participate in rituals at the temple or worship with the community.
So, completely different way of thinking about it than just avoiding spoiled food. Okay, we've looked at the land. Now let's dive into the waters. What were the rules for clean and unclean creatures that lived there?
For the creatures living in the water, the rules change, just like their environment is different. Leviticus 11, verse 9 puts it simply. These you may eat of all that are in the waters. Everything in the waters that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, you may eat. Pretty straightforward. You can see it right there.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. The fish we typically eat, salmon, trout, cod, sardines, those all have fins to swim and scales to protect them. They fit perfectly into what Yahweh laid out. But what about all the other creatures that live in the seas and rivers that don't have those features?
Verses 10 through 12 address that directly, and the language is strong. It says that anything in the seas or rivers that doesn't have fins and scales, all those swarming things, are detestable. It even calls them an abomination, which means something is deeply offensive and unacceptable to Yahweh.
Abomination is a powerful word. You can feel the rejection in it. It really emphasizes how important this distinction is. What would be some examples of those creatures without fins and scales that the Israelites weren't allowed to eat?
Think about shrimp, lobster, crab, catfish, eel, and shellfish like oysters and clams. Today, people consider many of these to be delicacies, but according to Yahweh's instructions back then, they weren't to be eaten. They didn't have those fins and scales, so they were outside of what was considered acceptable food. Seeing those familiar foods through that ancient lens really does change your perspective. And it wasn't just about eating them either, was it? The carcasses of these creatures considered an abomination also held a special significance.
Absolutely. Verse 11 really emphasizes this point. They shall remain a detestable thing to you. Of their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall regard as detestable. This reinforces the idea that it wasn't just about food choices. It was about aligning yourself with Yahweh's order and avoiding what he saw as detestable. It's about being set apart.
From the depths of the sea, let's take to the air and look at the birds. The guidelines for them seem a bit more subtle, perhaps focusing more on what they do rather than how they look.
That's a good observation. Leviticus 11 verse 13 begins this section by stating, "And these you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable." And the list that follows does seem to be categorized based on their nature as scavengers or predators. It's almost like Yahweh is separating them based on how they handle life and death. That makes a lot of sense, especially when we think about the main theme of holiness and staying away from things that are defiled, especially death. So which birds are considered detestable here?
The list is pretty long, including birds of prey known for hunting, like eagles, vultures, buzzards, various kinds of kites and falcons and ravens. These are birds that actively kill for food or eat things that have already died. Then it lists birds that are often found in dark or desolate places, like the ostrich, different owls, the tawny owl, the little owl, the long-eared owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, the carrion vulture, the stork, various types of herons, the hoopoe, and even the bat. Even though the bat is a mammal, it's included here probably because it flies.
It's a diverse list, and you're right, the bat being included is interesting. It seems like the classification was based more on what they did and where they lived, rather than a strict scientific classification like we have today. So if these were the birds to avoid, which birds could they eat?
The text doesn't give us a complete list of what's allowed, but it seems like it's the opposite of the unclean birds. Birds that are generally considered clean are those that aren't mainly scavengers or predators. We can assume this includes doves, quail, and partridges, which were even used in sacrifices sometimes. And while chickens and turkeys aren't specifically named in Leviticus 11, Jewish tradition considers them clean because they're not scavengers or birds of prey. It's about sticking with food sources that support life.
So for the birds, it's less about what they look like and more about how they act. That's a fascinating difference compared to the land and water creatures. Let's move on to a category that's often forgotten: insects. Here's where we find some very specific and even surprising rules.
Definitely. Leviticus 11 verses 20 through 23 starts with a general rule. All winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. This would include most flying insects that walk or crawl when they're not flying. But then verse 21 gives us an important exception. Yet among the winged insects that go on all fours, you may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet with which to hop on the ground.
Oh, so it's all about whether they can jump. I'm thinking of grasshoppers and locusts.
You got it. Verse 22 lists the specific insects that are allowed. Of these you may eat the locust of every kind, the bald locust of every kind, the cricket of every kind, and the grasshopper of every kind. These are the insects with those big, strong legs made for jumping.
So while most flying insects were off limits, the ones that hopped were okay. That's a very specific distinction. What about all the other flying insects that can't jump?
Verse 23 confirms that they are not allowed, but all other winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you. This would be insects like flies, bees, wasps, ants, beetles, ones that don't have that special ability to jump. It reminds us that Yahweh's instructions often have precise details that we might not understand right away.
It really shows how carefully thought out these divine instructions are. We also see a brief mention of creeping things in this chapter. What falls under that category, and what were the rules about them?
Leviticus 11, verses 29 through 31, gives us some examples of creeping things that were considered unclean. These are creatures that usually stay close to the ground and don't have wings.
What kind of creatures are we talking about? Give us some examples.
The list includes moles, mice, probably including other small rodents, and different types of lizards: the large lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. They are a mix of small animals that live on or near the ground.
A combination of small mammals and reptiles. And just like some of the other unclean animals, there were rules about touching their dead bodies, right?
Right. Verse 31 wraps up this section by saying, "These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening." This emphasizes the principle we've seen before, that touching the dead bodies of certain animals makes a person unclean.
With all these categories and specific rules, how did this uncleanness spread, and what did people do to purify themselves?
Verses 32 through 40 go into detail about how uncleanness could be passed from the dead bodies of unclean animals to people and objects. It often involved washing and waiting until sundown to be considered clean again.
And there were special instructions for different containers and vessels, weren't there? What happened if, for instance, an unclean animal fell into a clay pot?
Verse 33 says, "And if any of them falls into an earthenware vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it." Because earthenware is porous, the uncleanness was thought to permeate the whole vessel, making it unfit for sacred use. In a similar way, verse 35 tells us that if the carcass of an unclean animal fell into an oven or cooking stove, it became unclean and had to be broken down. This really shows how seriously they took ritual purity, especially when preparing food.
Breaking a whole pot or oven seems pretty drastic. It really highlights the importance of staying separate. But there was a difference when it came to natural sources of water, wasn't there? They weren't as easily contaminated.
That's right. Verse 36 points that out. "But a spring or a cistern holding water shall be clean, but whoever touches a carcass in them shall be unclean." This suggests that flowing or large bodies of water were thought to be able to cleanse themselves naturally or resist becoming permanently unclean. In these cases, only the person who touched the carcass was unclean.
So we've covered the categories and specific rules, but what's the overall message here? Why did Yahweh give all these detailed instructions? What was the point of it all?
The main theme throughout Leviticus 11, especially in verses 43 through 45, is the call to holiness. It's not just about physical health or cleanliness, although those might have been side benefits. The main purpose was spiritual. Yahweh wanted his people to be consecrated, to be kodesh, set apart, because he is kadosh, holy, as verse 44 says. "For I am Yahweh your Elohim. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy."
So following all these specific and sometimes strange rules about what to eat and not eat was a way for the Israelites to show Yahweh's unique and holy nature in their everyday lives.
Precisely. Verse 47 clearly states the reason for these instructions: to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten. It was about making that difference clear in everything they did, including the food they ate. These weren't just random rules. They were meant to shape their identity as a people set apart for Yahweh.
It's almost as if these dietary rules were a constant physical reminder of their special relationship with Yahweh. It wasn't just about food. It was about who they were, about obeying him, and showing their devotion in a tangible way.
You got it. These rules taught them order, discernment, and the essential importance of following Yahweh's ways in everything they did, even something as simple as eating. It was a practical, everyday way to live out their commitment to the covenant.
When you see it that way, it makes you wonder how someone today, someone deeply rooted in this tradition, let's say a modern-day Israelite theologian devoted to Yahweh, might see these ancient instructions. What would they think about how these laws apply to our world today?
That's a really important question for anyone trying to live a life centered around Yahweh. While different traditions and times might interpret and apply these practices in various ways, the basic principle of honoring Yahweh and living a life set apart for him never changes. For a theologian today who is immersed in the Hebrew Scriptures, these instructions in Leviticus 11 might be a powerful reminder that our physical and spiritual lives are connected. What we choose to eat, how we interact with nature, these can be seen as actions that either bring us closer to or further away from Yahweh's holiness.
It goes beyond just a list of what you can and can't eat, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you think about what it really means to be set apart for Yahweh in a world that often ignores or even rejects these kinds of distinctions.
Absolutely. It challenges us with some deep questions for our lives today. How do we show holiness in our choices? How does our physical life reflect our commitment to Yahweh? While people might disagree on how every single rule from Leviticus 11 applies to us today, the basic idea of trying to honor Yahweh in everything, including what we put into our bodies, is still profoundly important for those who want to live a life dedicated to him.
As we finish this deep dive into the rich and detailed instructions of Leviticus 11, it's clear that the main takeaway is much more than just a list of foods to avoid. It's a powerful look into Yahweh's desire for his people to be set apart for him, reflecting his perfect holiness in everything they do, from the biggest acts of worship to the smallest daily decisions.
Exactly. And listener, we encourage you to continue learning and thinking about these timeless instructions. Think about their original context in the covenant, their enduring principles, and what they might mean for your own walk with Yahweh today.
That's a truly enriching way to look at it. As we wrap up, here's a final thought-provoking question for you to ponder. Even if we don't apply them in the same way today, how can these ancient principles of clean and unclean guide us as we serve Yahweh? What other distinctions might he be calling us to recognize and honor as we strive to be holy?
May Yahweh give you understanding and bless you as you seek to walk in his holiness.
All praise to the Most High Yahweh. Shalom.